Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I painted this Highland Cow in acrylics. Now the first thing I actually do when working with acrylics is to paint the background, and that is shown on the real-time version on Patreon, along with of course all of the processes that I'm using for the Highland Cow itself. So if that's of interest, I'll link that in the description below. Now when it comes to painting realistic hair or fur, the layering process is really important. As you can see here, this does look pretty terrible, but it has to start somewhere, and for me, my first process is getting a good base foundation in. I don't want there to be any harsh start and stop points between the lights and the darks, because I find that's harder to get the fur looking softer when I do start building details. Now the other thing you can see is this looks more like a grayscale painting, and then I'm going to work with my colour through the use of glazes. Now I've got a video here on YouTube that speaks about how I use glazes, and I'm showing that on various different paintings, so if that's of interest I'll link that video in the description below. But what this enables me to do here is, as you can see I'm working with a glaze now, is that enables me to just focus on the layering process, building up the details and the lights and the darks. So each layer I'm adding here, it gets gradually lighter, and then I can focus on the colour in a different process. I don't have to do both things at the same time. Now this makes it so much easier throughout the layering process, because when we're mixing our paint, we really don't have to be worrying about mixing the exact colour. It's all about the shade of that colour, so how light or how dark it should be. Now when I worked on the hair on the ear, the hair texture is significantly different, much thicker, so I started off with a little bit more of a larger round brush and then switched over to a liner brush here. Now using different brushes is going to vary depending on the animal, the fur, the hair texture that we are painting, but for this I did want to have a variation with how thick my brush strokes were. Now you can of course do that with a liner brush by adjusting how much pressure you apply to the brush, but I personally like to use a range of different brushes in a painting so that my brush strokes don't look the same. I like to have that variation, which helps to give a little bit more of a natural look. Now the other thing you'll notice is I do like to work in small sections, and when I came to working on the horn here, you'll see that I'm doing a lot of wet on wet blending. Now wet on wet blending is where you don't allow the paint to dry, and with acrylics you've got a couple of different options of achieving that. Now here I've just got a couple of colours mixed, and I'm not allowing the first colour to dry and then start adding the second colour. But if you were working on larger areas, you could use a fine mist spray bottle and actually just put a layer of water over the top, and that will prevent that paint from drying, and you can keep that wet for hours if needed. Now that's something that I do cover in many of my real-time tutorials on Patreon. So if blending acrylics, the details, how to use the brushes and so on is something you would like to see in more depth, then as I've said, my Patreon is linked in the description below. Now the other thing is, where I do work on small sections at a time rather than whole individual layers, I'm able to get that one area more accurate to that reference photo. Now for me that's quite a big deal mentally in terms of how I approach that painting. Now I find that if I work on whole individual layers, that I spend more time hesitating, looking at that reference photo and thinking where should I be, and that's purely because we're looking at too much of a larger area. Now of course if you do like to work in that way, that is absolutely fine, but if you do feel that you're finding yourself hesitating, not quite sure where you should be, then that is an indication that you're working on too much of a larger area. Really scale that down 1 or 2 inches if needed. Now this will also really help with building up more depth in the piece, especially if you are hesitating working on a larger area. Now what I mean by that is, if we're only focusing on 1 or 2 square inches at a time, we can focus on more of the actual layers that we need to be capturing rather than potentially rushing through certain layers. Now rushing through the midtones, I often find this is the one area that is skipped through. By missing that out, the depth is lacking in that hair or fur, whatever it is, feathers, it doesn't matter, but if those midtones are missed out, then that fur can look very flat and two-dimensional. So you can see here that all these values that I'm building up, I don't jump to my brightest highlights. I've got loads of layers underneath before I get to that. Now even at this stage, it's not finished. I've got lots more details, little tweaks to add, but it's all about just working with that one layer at a time, and then if you start to feel that you need to have a break, you can either work on another section like I did with the ear. I've got that base layer in place there, and then I tweak the area around the eye. Now I can go back to the horn. So by working in this way, breaking it up and only really focusing on that one element at a time, I prevent myself from becoming overwhelmed. Now this real-time tutorial on Patreon, it really does focus on good brush technique, how to use the brush, how to load the paint onto the brush. That's a really big thing when painting fine hairs like this. If we've got too much paint on that brush, or the consistency of paint versus water isn't right, then the brush isn't going to work as intended. So all of that is something that I do cover in the real-time version, and because I create the voiceover while I'm painting, I'm able to explain every single process in the moment. But as you can see here, as I'm beginning to layer, I'm really starting to exaggerate my brush strokes. Now I've got a video here on YouTube, it's my top tips for painting realistic fur in acrylics. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But one of the few things that I talk about there is brush technique. Now for me, brush technique, it does range in, it depends on which photograph we're working from, the animal, the fur texture that we're painting. But there are three main fundamental aspects that I focus on. That's the fur length, the fur thickness, and the fur direction. Now all of those three things are going to massively influence the texture that we're replicating in that painting. So as you can see here, I'm having to turn my painting around quite a lot in order to get that liner brush to move in the way that I intend. It's very hard to sometimes get that angle on your hand with the brush when working up the right way. So if you do need to turn your painting around at any times, then it's something that is really worthwhile doing. You'll find you'll get a better angle on that brush, and you can create far more natural brush strokes. Now the hair or fur direction, as I've mentioned, this here is not random. It follows the underlying bone and muscular structure, but that is more so for shorter coated animals. When you're working on hair that's as long as this, the length of that fur or hair has much more freedom to move. So for instance, if it's on a windy day, you're not going to have the structure underneath the skin as visible as you would on something like a Labrador. But you still want to be making sure that we are moving the brush accurately to follow that fur or hair direction, because it does help to form the shape of the face. Because even though this hair is longer, it's still curving over the top of the skull, it still curves over the eye sockets. So we do have to be making sure that we are really studying that reference photo closely. Now then that leads us on to the length of those brush strokes. So the length of the brush strokes is just as important as the direction. So if we make brush strokes that are too short, then of course we're going to make it look like the Highland Cow has had a haircut, which we do really want to be aware of. And if those brush strokes are too long, then we're going to make it just not resemble that animal. So the length of the brush strokes, if it's a Labrador and you start making your brush strokes too long, you could end up with something that looks more like a German Shepherd coat. So it is something that we do have to pay very close attention to, which is why brush technique is so important. Now the exact brushes that we're using in terms of the brand, I personally am not so precious about, but how I use that brush, that's something that I really do want to emphasize. The way that we load the paint onto the brush, as I said, the consistency of paint versus water. We could be using a brush and getting very frustrated with the results because it might not be the brush that's causing the problem. It may just be that the consistency of the paint, maybe there's too much water or there's too much paint and the brush stroke is getting start and stop points. That there is an indication that the mixture is not right. It's not necessarily the brush that may be causing that problem. Now onto the nose and the mouth area. This is where the blending techniques become more emphasized, just like when we worked on the horns. Now I'm not doing any techniques that are different. I still use the same wet on wet blending methods for the fur, but here I want to be making sure that I'm replicating the details in the right way. So I won't be creating actual brush strokes, but I'll be more dabbing with the brush just to hint at a different texture. Now the brush strokes here are going to be varied because I'm adjusting the pressure. Now this is something that is very apparent with any brush that we use. The different pressure that we apply is going to give us a range of brush strokes. So very light pressure, you're going to get, in this instance, a smaller dot. If you apply more pressure, you're going to get a larger dot. So it's just something that we have to be making sure that we keep varied to again make sure that that painting looks more natural. Now I've already spoken about the length of our brush strokes, and here is a prime example. The fur or hair around any nose, it doesn't matter if it's a dog, cat, whatever it may be, is usually always shorter than the fur on the rest of the face. The exception would be breeds such as a cockapoo. Those are going to have much more of that curlier, wavy, longer fur around the mouth. But for something like this, these animals, we do want to be paying attention to the variation in the length of that coat. And we want to be shortening or lengthening our brush strokes accordingly. You know, again here above on the bridge of the nose, this here is slightly longer, but it's not as long as the hair on the very top of the head. So I've had to be making sure that I'm studying that photo at all times. Now as I work on this section, you're going to see more of the glazing process, and glazing is something that I get asked a lot of questions about, and the one thing that can cause issues is if we don't allow the painting to dry. Now a glaze for me is just a paint that I thin with water. You can see here I'm making it more of a brown colour, and it is just the paint that I've mixed and I've thinned it with water. There's no mixing medium or anything in there. But what you have to do is make sure that the layers underneath are completely dry before you add a glaze. If the painting is just even slightly tacky, that's going to mix in with the glaze, and then the glaze is not going to be effective. So you're just going to end up creating a real muddy mess with that layering process. So it's so important to make sure that those layers underneath are dry. Now if the layers are dry and you apply your glaze over the top, the glaze is there just to tint the layers so you can adjust the colour, or you can adjust the lightness or the darkness of that area of hair. So it's something that I want to be focusing on, and I use it for a range of techniques, and as I've said, that's all explained in that glazing video here on YouTube. But for me, I use glazing in every single painting. I love how it adds extra depth. I don't have to be worrying about mixing the exact colour at all. I can do all of that separately. Now again, I do cover all of this thoroughly in my Patreon tutorials, very step by step, and the use of glazes can really just make any painting process far easier. The mixing of colours is something that I'm also asked a lot of questions about. How do we know which colours to mix at each point? Well, we really don't have to worry about that if we're using glazes, because we can focus on that aspect later on in that process. Now here I'm using a white charcoal pencil to actually draw in areas that I need to change later on with more layers of my acrylic paint. So I'm not using that pencil to add those details, because all of that's going to get painted over. But sometimes if we keep on making adjustments with the paint, we get a little lost with what actually needs adjusting, and we end up sort of making changes that are not necessary. So in this situation, I wanted to have something that was clearly visible to me, that I could pinpoint exactly what I wanted to change later on. And I wanted to just shift a few of the clumps of the hair on the left hand side. I wanted to move those. You can see in the photo in the corner of my finished painting, I've got more of a triangular, like a diamond shape in between the eyes, whereas on my current painting now, I've squared it off a little bit on the left hand side, and I just didn't like that. So I wanted to make sure that I had something that was different to paint, so therefore the charcoal pencil, that I could clearly map that in, the changes that I needed to make. Now, as I said, I'm not going to leave it like that. The white gets completely covered and I can erase that with water. But by having that in, I know exactly where I need to go in and make those alterations. And just putting a little bit of a light colour underneath that right hand eye on the eyelid area has just helped to adjust the expression of that Highland cow. Now, something that I'm very passionate about is on my Patreon tutorials, if I make a mistake or I feel like I need to adjust something like this that's going to make my painting better, I will always include those areas of that tutorial in my lesson. I would never cut that out. If it's a mistake, I do a brush stroke or something, a layer that is just not right, I will show how to fix that. And because mistakes like this happen fairly frequently, it's just having that information, that knowledge to go, okay, a mistake has happened, but it's fine, I can fix that. And then it's information that I've gained that I can transfer across to the next painting. So it's at this stage where I'm making those changes, just adjusting the shape of the hair between the eyes, of really just tweaking those little bits on the eyelid and adding those final details. Now, if you've got an area of the hair that is in front of something, so for instance the hair on the lower part of the ear, that is in front of the body, you do want to be making sure that you're finishing with those details to really pull the face forward and push the body back. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be very, very grateful. And if you are interested in painting along to this real-time tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. If you've got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll be uploading another video next week.